Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Welcome to Morning Shot. And today, Ryan Huang and I, Ma Doctor, are talking about shocks, but not the shocks you and I typically would associate with. I'm talking about the second China shock, right?
China. A new wave of Chinese exports is rippling across Southeast Asia. So we've got cheap, high-quality electric vehicles flooding car markets, textiles, and even F&B chains out-competing local businesses. And so ASEAN economies are feeling the pressure of what some are calling the second China shock.
And this time it seems that Southeast Asia is in the crosshairs, and it's raising some pretty tough questions. Are local industries at risk of being hollowed out? And how should the region balance protecting local jobs with keeping economic ties strong with China? Well, we hope to find the answers to those questions from Ravi Velloor, who's an associate editor and senior columnist with the Straits Times, and he is joining us live here in the studio. Good morning, Ravi.
Hey, morning. It's nice to be with you, chaps.
Yeah, nice to have you on. Now, for context, many have not grown up with this idea of the second China shock or even the first China shock. Can we go back in time down memory lane and dive into what that first China shock was about, how it played out globally?
Well, you know, the first China shock refers to China's entry into the WTO at the turn of the century in 2001. And really nobody expected the impact that it would have on global manufacturing, and how quickly the Chinese would move into pole position and grabbing the majority share of global manufacturing, and so rapidly. Nobody expected it at that point. But the biggest shock at that time was to the United States, and many of them willingly moved their factories over to China. Quite happily so. They were happy to do it. Made a lot of money. The U.S. gained from it. The services economy was powering along for the United States, so it did not feel the impact so much. So that was the first China shock.
All right, so we've got a first China shock now and moving into the second one. So that involved the first one with the U.S. Why is Southeast Asia now in the spotlight?
Well, Ryan, there are several factors at play here. And, in the first place, I want to say that, look, when you say second China shock, it seems as though the Chinese have, come in with a live electric pole and they're sticking it into us or something like that. It's not really like that. But the fact is that the Chinese have become very, very good at what they do, which is manufacturing. And this is not from a mercantilistic approach. They have not devalued their currency to, outcompete us. They have done it through sheer efficiency. And they've done a wonderful job back home. Their infrastructure is first class. Their systems are good. And I heard at a conference last year, China being described as the fitness center for global manufacturing.
Interesting.
I think that's really, and that came from a Western investor. So, it really is that they become very good at what they do. But the rest of the world is still catching up, and they have, and it sits, and for that temporary time until the rest of the world catch up or improve their systems, infrastructure, and all that, we're going to have this phenomenon. So that's the primary thing is Chinese efficiency. They've become very good. Their goods are cheaper. They can transport faster. But there's a secondary thing, and which is the recent tariffs have also seen pressure on China to maintain its export machine one way or the other. If you look at data for May, there's been a 43% drop in exports to the United States, but there's been a 15% increase in exports to ASEAN.
Right.
A 12% increase in exports to the European Union, So one assumes that not all that 15% is being dumped on ASEAN. Some of it is probably being rerouted to the United States through ASEAN. But the fact is that it's very uncomfortable for a lot of countries here, And, the Chinese have got to the stage where they can even make batik shirts. Can you imagine the impact it has on the Indonesian economy? Last year, Indonesia shed 80,000 jobs in the textile sector. Their biggest company, Straits Times, a textile company, has folded, So all over the world, the second China shock, so-called second China shock, is being felt. but particularly so in the ASEAN region.
Yeah, you mentioned Indonesia's textile closures. Thailand's auto industry is also under pressure. Are we looking potentially at the risk of premature deindustrialization in parts of ASEAN, despite the fact that we should appreciate Chinese efficiency?
I would think we are. And part of it is because technology has changed. You mentioned Thailand, Imad. It's really, the ICE, the internal combustion engines.
Yeah.
They are finished. But Thailand is still in that era. All the Toyotas, Suzuki, Subaru, Nissan, all these big companies. Well, the Chinese dominate in EVs. And they have yet to build the domestic supply chain. So most of the parts are still being imported from China. And so even if it's so-called manufactured in Thailand, most of the parts come from China. So what that means is it's terrible for local industry. It's terrible for local ancillary industries, the whole ecosystem. It's bad for jobs. Between 2001 and 2024, last year in 3 years, there's been an average of 100 factory closures per month in Thailand. So these are significant numbers. And they stand up and hit you in the face.
I do want to unpack that part when you talk about deindustrialization,
yes,
where folks are moving out of the value chain, which I imagine is good, which is what the US went through, higher value jobs, services, for example. That seems to be a good thing and inevitable to some degree.
Well, you could say that, but more than as an economist, I focus on national security and geopolitics. And for me, this is not an isolated phenomenon. It has to be also seen in conjunction with other trends that are happening, such as automation, the march of AI. All this is affecting employment. I've been writing about this from 2013. The March of the Machines was the first piece I published in March of 2013, I think. And since then, now China is also all right, the Chinese are pushing all these goods into Southeast Asia, but the fact is that even at home, they're challenged on the employment front because many of the factories that make these are dark factories. And as you know, there's a big concern about youth unemployment in China. So I suspect that's going to be magnified in Southeast Asia, and we need to be careful about it. We need to be watchful about it.
Yeah, what might also be magnified is the idea of friendshoring, Western firms diversifying supply chains, shifting production and investment to countries considered politically aligned with the West, aiming to reduce reliance on China and mitigate geopolitical risks. Do you see that being a reality?
Well, I would think you have to be a little careful there, Matt, because, there's a very tight strategic relationship developing between the U.S. and India. But if you remember, just about a month ago, Donald Trump told Tim Cook of Apple, hey, you're not going to make in India and sell to the United States. They can look after themselves. I want you to make it at home. So, there is an argument that the U.S. may be a little kinder to countries that it considers friendly to it. But the way Trump is going, and from what I see this morning, which you talked about in your opening remarks, I'm yet to see that, So I think he's going to be very hard-nosed, at least for the short term, while he negotiates.
Yeah, Ravi, how do you see ASEAN striking that balancing act? On one hand, you've got market forces dictating things. If it's efficient, go there, which is China. On the other hand, you talk about industries that need to be protected. So to some degree, tariffs or even non-tariff measures?
Well, tariffs are a bad word, and I think we should try not go in that direction to the extent we can. But there are other ways we can possibly keep an eye on these things. One could be taxes in some countries, GST, VAT, on these small items that come in a flood from and are pushed to us through Shein and Temu, all these other things. You have to be a little careful. Better surveillance of the supply chain. And coordination between ASEAN countries. Vietnam has beaten the rest of the pack and signed this deal with the United States, which is why it's not in this morning's news. It's escaped because it was quick off the bat. But while it's fine for individual countries to look at their own interests, I do believe that it's time that there is an ASEAN level discussion and possibly coordination if you can get it done.
Coming together as a bloc to get a deal done.
Well, yeah, to an extent, at least discuss this. One of the key themes that ASEAN has been talking about lately is resilience. And I think economic resilience is very important, resilience on the jobs front. So I think it's time that these things were discussed at ASEAN level. And, and I suspect that if you take these concerns to China together, I have no reason to believe that the Chinese will not give you a sympathetic hearing, despite their own priorities.
So against the backdrop of everything we've discussed, do you foresee any potential risk of this shock accelerating a global decoupling from China, or is that a far-fetched idea?
That is not going to be easy. For instance, I spoke about Tim Cook and Apple, right? So much of the components come from China. They needed the engineers to come from Taiwan and, Chinese engineers. While the world is not that easy to decouple, but, cosmetically you can pull a few things to please audiences, but it's not going to be so easy. But long term, I do think that trend is being set in motion.
Now, talk about trends. How urgent is this issue or concern right now? Because you do see a lot of Chinese brands also going overseas, the likes of BYDs and many of those chain restaurants. In some spaces, taking up what used to be homegrown brands as well.
Well, in Singapore, it really doesn't matter to me, whether the Japanese push their Toyotas to me or the Germans push their Mercedes to me. I drive a Mercedes, but 20% of Mercedes Daimler-Benz is owned by Chinese people. People don't know that. So the world is really interconnected. Now, it doesn't matter to me if the BYD is good, which I think it is. It's beautifully designed and, it's cheap. I'll buy it. It doesn't matter to me. But, whether the Japanese get pushed out of this market and the Chinese come in, or the Americans come in and push out the Chinese, as long as the product is good. To me, what matters is, to the extent possible, if I buy, let's say if I'm a Filipino and I buy the Chinese ice cream brand called Ice, I don't know if you're aware of it, AICE. It's owned by Chinese. And they've been pushing up and out-competing Unilever's Selector ice creams in Thailand. In the Philippines. Now, it doesn't matter to me. If they are more innovative, they can give me better flavors and they can source the milk and the components locally and sell it back to me. I'm fine with Chinese goods, no problem. But I'm agnostic on that issue. The only thing that bothers me is that to the extent that it's sourced locally, that creates local employment, that's what I'm looking for, and I wish that would be the focus.
So there's no concern then that ASEAN countries may become transit points for Chinese overcapacity rather than tech innovators in their own right?
Well, I think we've not been that great on innovation, to tell you the truth. But we are, in some ways, part of this trade is we are transit people, and that's the way it's going to be. Water will always find its way around. Look for little nooks and crannies to get through, and that's what trade does. And some of it might happen.
All right, we've been in conversation with Ravi Velloor. He is the Associate Editor and Senior Columnist with the Straits Times, walking us through his piece on the second China shock.
With some shocking revelations. Ravi, thank you so much for your time this morning.
It's been wonderful being with you folks this morning. Thank you.
Stay with us on Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.